nonlinear or undulating periodization is now where you have actual intensity fluctuations within the actual week or microcycle. So this is where you'll have heavy, light, medium days over the course of the week. There is some evidence to show that this is better than linear, possibly due to less neural stress because of the fact you're having high intensity training done throughout the year. You're not putting it off till one time and having the athlete having to deal with that. So they're kind of trained for the high intensity work over the course of the year. However, at the same time, you're also having a greater overall intensity in their training, so there is the possibility that they could overtrain through that mechanism. So in just comparing the two that we had discussed, with nonlinear training, you do run the possibility of overtraining if you don't know how to cycle through the intensities over the course of the week, or even you don't ever deload within the training period. Even the nonlinear should probably have deloads and transitions properly placed. With linear, the problem with that is you're only focusing on one quality at a time. So one, you could be having possibly too much stress on the nervous system, particularly when you're only doing the high intensity training during the part of the year. Plus, you're also, I don't have this up here, but you're also not introducing you're not maintaining rather the other qualities that you work on. So if you're strictly just working on the high volume, low intensity work, you're not training the nervous system. In other words, you're not getting any of that high intensity work during that part of the year. So that's the other drawback to that. Now there's going to be some other forms of periodization that we're going to discuss that aren't in the text, that kind of look at and there are some that are very similar to these two we've already discussed. So the conjugate method, or also called concurrent periodization. So this is where you train multiple qualities at one time. It's also referred to as the concurrent model. This is good particularly for athletes who only have a short period of time to train. However, it could be used over the course of the entire year if programmed intelligently. So this is where you would have, for instance, from the strength training perspective, you would train maximum strength, dynamic strength, and hypertrophy all within the course of the week. The other key with the conjugate method, if used in its purest sense, particularly where you're using max effort method, in other words, lifts approaching 90 to 100%, is using an exercise rotation. So for your primary lifts, when you see this getting done, there's a constant rotation of those primary lifts. So in other words, you're not just doing, for instance, a straight bar squat and a straight bar bench as your main exercises. You'll be constantly rotating the exercise over the course of the year. Vertical integration is a concept that was put forth by the late Charlie Francis, who was a track and field coach in Canada. And it's kind of similar to the idea of the conjugate method, but where this is organized, basically looking at all training elements. So this goes beyond just the strength work. This looks at, sprint volumes, any type of aerobic capacity training that you do. All those elements are present in the training program at all times, but just in varying volumes. So in other words, obviously there's a limited amount of stress that the athletes can take based upon what they're doing as far as lifting, sprinting, jumps, whatever it is. But what you do is you vary the volumes of those, but you always have some form of them present throughout the entire year. And one of the keys to this is organizing the training weeks through what's called a high-low approach, simply meaning that if you have a high-intensity day, your next day should be primarily low-intensity work. So in other words, your high-intensity work would be your heavier strength work, your explosive jumps, and your speed work. Your low-intensity work would be things like aerobic tempo work, lower intensity strength training, so like auxiliary exercises or strength work below 80%, like abdominal work, things like that would be present on the low intensity days. It also integrates a general physical prep phase during the yearly plan, so based upon what the athlete's experience is with training, they may do one phase of very general kind of lower intensity work just to kind of prepare them for the training that comes after that. So in talking earlier, particularly mentioning the conjugate method, I talked about how one of the kind of keys with that is if you're going to be doing max effort work for prolonged periods of time, the key would be is to change up your main exercises. So again, you wouldn't want to you won't be able to lift 90 to 100%, for instance, in just a straight bar squat because of the accommodation that takes place. So you vary it. So I'm just showing some pictures of different types of variations of what we would consider primary lifts. So instead of a squat, we have a box squat. Instead of a bench press, there's a picture of a board press and a floor press with what's called a Swiss bar that has the handles placed differently. Instead of a deadlift, you have the rickshaw machine. So you'd want to incorporate those. Typically, whenever I've done something like this, they typically say, well, you can change the exercises every week. I tend to change them every 2 to 3 weeks if I'm using this type of technique with a field sport athlete, particularly if they don't have a whole lot of experience with the lift. So usually what I have them do is, the first week they'll work up to a pretty hard one, and then the next week maybe try to break what they had previously done that prior week. If they have a little bit more experience, I might change up the exercises a bit more, but I tend to stick maybe 2 or 3 weeks with an exercise, particularly in someone with a little less experience. Okay, block training or conjugate periodization. Now, notice the terminology. Okay, so block training, conjugate periodization, that's not the same as the conjugate method. Okay, so they're two different things even though they're using similar terms. So block training is highly concentrated loads, or what we'd call 3 to 4 week blocks of training. And what this starts with is it starts with an accumulation phase, gradual increase in volume and intensity. Then you have what's called the concentration or transmutation phase, where there's an increase in intensity and frequency of training. And then you have an intensification phase where there's lower frequency and high intensity, possibly going as far as to test. For instance, this would be where, if you're looking to see how you've progressed strength-wise, you would test to see, where you're at in the main lifts. You'll notice a couple things here. One, this sounds very similar to linear periodization, which in a lot of senses it is. It's different from what we traditionally do in Western periodization with the linear model, in that they basically put the linear model but in a shortened period of time. So whereas with the linear model you would go low intensity to high intensity over the course of the year, you would do these phases, the accumulation, concentration, and then intensification. You would do that in a shorter period of time. So in a sense, it's similar to the gradual increase of linear periodization. However, with this, you have these somewhat larger pockets of training that take place. So even within the accumulation phase, you're not necessarily going to be doing all per se low intensity work. You're gradually working yourself up. So that's the whole idea behind that. And then you'll have then that'll progress you through the other two phases. So It is different overall when you're looking at over the course of the year from the linear model, but it has similar properties to it in that there is a somewhat gradual progressive overload. So with block training, and you'll also hear at times I'll refer to training blocks. When I talk about my training, I very seldomly ever use pure block training, but I always talk about training blocks. Um, that's all. That's just referring to, typically for me, just a mesocycle. But when you're talking pure block training, that's when you're talking having those three phases as I had described. So there will also be deloads worked into within the course of the year. During blocks, you could try to maintain other qualities. It's important to try to do that. It's hard to do pure block training as it relates to the entirety of work for field sport athletes, just because there's so many qualities to train in a field sport athlete. For track and field, it could work pretty good because typically you're looking at one primary quality for those athletes because they specialize in events. It's also really only beneficial if you're going to train people for longer periods of time. So this would be a situation where, like, for instance, at like a private facility where you may only have an athlete for 6 to 8 weeks, you're not going to be able to obviously do block training. The conjugate method or concurrent method would work better in that instance. As I had described, it's similar to what we discussed with the Western periodization linear model. The differences being that you'll repeat the three blocks over the course of the year. Plus, you'll also attempt to maintain other qualities during the training blocks. So these are your learning outcomes as it relates to what we had just talked about. One of the things about periodization, again, in the end, when you're talking training athletes, periodization is essentially just planning out their training. I've seen it where sometimes individuals will actually use kind of different types of periodization within the training meaning that and here would be a situation where you'd have maybe an athlete who their overall scheme is kind of a vertical integration model where all their training variables are present, but then the strength work will be block trained. So in other words, they'll still be doing all their other types of training. They'll still be doing sprints, jumps, their other high intensity work, but they'll have accumulation, concentration, and intensification with their weight work. So, I have seen that, and that's something that can definitely be done. And other people are just kind of purist and just stick with one type of training. Again, there's benefits and drawbacks to all of them. I think in the end that, you'll kind of see as we talk more and more about the different types of training in class, you'll kind of get an idea for, kind of how to utilize a little bit of everything with your individual athletes.